So we often think misinformation is about a scam, but what is dangerous is actually some misinformation can be completely true, but it's misleading.
Alex Edmonds is an economist and professor of finance at the London Business School. His book, called May Contain Lies, is about our biases and how they're exploited and what we can do about it.
You release dopamine when you see something you like. If you see something you don't like, this activates the amygdala. So that's the part of the brain that induces a fight or flight response. So even if somebody's been completely truthful, you don't necessarily want to follow his or her advice because they might have just got lucky. And that's particularly the case for money. The solution to misinformation is already within you.
Statistics can seem they don't have real world impacts really, or they're just broad data sets. When you say this guy ended up in prison because of this person's decisions, it makes it a lot more real.
Thanks.
And we will get into that.
Okay.
But you have a quote within the book that says, misinformation surrounds us and affects our everyday lives, how we vote, learn a skill, or improve our health. This is obviously, we like to talk about money here. So how do you think it affects money and our finances?
Yeah, it absolutely applies to money. So the only reason I mentioned those three is that they say you should write in patterns of three. So friends, Romans, countrymen. So that's why I mentioned vote, skill, and health. But if it was a pattern of four, I would have absolutely said money, because we often base our decisions on some stories. So this person invested in cryptocurrency, made a killing, or this person invested in tech. And so we will often try to base our decisions on examples, but those examples might be misleading.
And one is, do you have any specific finance examples that jump to mind in the modern world at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what's important is that misinformation can be pretty subtle. So we often think misinformation is about a scam. So somebody lies. So I've got this great investment opportunity and actually they siphon the money elsewhere. But what is dangerous is actually some misinformation can be completely true, but it's misleading. So maybe your friend says, I invested in cryptocurrency and it went up, and he or she is being completely truthful. But does that mean that you should invest in cryptocurrency? You know, maybe you shouldn't, because you're buying it at a different price. It may well be that your friend got lucky. Maybe you've got 10 other friends who also invested in crypto and they lost money, but they will never tell you about this because they don't want to embarrass themselves. So even if somebody's been completely truthful, you don't necessarily want to follow his or her advice because they might have just got lucky. And that's particularly the case for money, perhaps even more than all the other things that we mentioned. Why? Because your investment returns depend on the state of the stock market, not just your investing skill.
Could this be societal as well, in the sense of a previous generation will say, you should buy houses because I got rich because of houses, but they rode an upwards trend in the housing market that might not repeat itself again, say?
Absolutely, right. We have the phrase safe as houses. And so the concern here is we just over extrapolate from what we had in the past. So we know the phrase past performance is not a guide to the future, but we don't pay attention to that, right? We see this, we think it's a legal disclaimer, but the way our minds operate is we learn from stories, we learn from history. If something worked for our parents, if something worked for our friends, we think it's going to work for us ourselves. And we can see this even outside of finance, right? One thing I play is fantasy football. And if a striker scores lots of goals in one particular week, then you see lots of people transferring him in, even though the price is really, really high, and even though it's quite unlikely that you're going to score a hat-trick in successive weeks. So we like to over-extrapolate from small bits of data, even if he was lucky in that particular game.
Especially if it's people you know, like friends or family. If you see someone online saying, oh, I made loads buying crypto, you're like, oh, good for you. But then if you see like your sister, your friend, your parents, house is a good investment, or your friend just made loads in Dogecoin, you might be like, oh, that's a great idea. I'll follow you because I know him and I'm just like him, so I can make money too. So it's a bit more bias when it's someone you know.
You're absolutely right, T. So this is something known as familiarity bias. So when it's somebody that you know, then you think that has more authority, well, when it shouldn't do, right? That person is no different from any random person, but we think that this is something which is more truthful. But the concern here is not the truth issue, because even if your friend is completely truthful, it may well not work for you because the price of cryptocurrency is different now from in the past. So we try to latch onto things that are familiar because we think truth is what is relevant. But in fact, that's not what's relevant. What matters is whether it's representative. Something that was true for your friend may well not be true for you because you're now investing at a different time.
What you're saying is having the facts isn't enough. And that seems contradictory in a way. You have an example in the book of someone who went to prison because a policeman went into a crime scene, saw the evidence and didn't like this person because they had a violent past. Yeah. They had an MO as well. And it was like, he's guilty. They prosecuted him on the basis of things like blood spatter on his shoes. It's a fact there was blood spatter on the shoes, but it wasn't factually accurate that he was the murderer.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is important. So this is the difference between two things which are often conflated, which are facts and evidence. We think this is pretty much the same thing. If something is factual, doesn't that mean it's good evidence? But no, because what does the word evidence mean? So let's go to your setting of a criminal trial. Evidence is evidence that supports one particular suspect. So the evidence suggests that it's Tom. That counts as evidence. But if the evidence suggests it could be Tom or Dick or Harry, that is not evidence. So there might be facts which are consistent with multiple possible suspects. That is just a fact. It is not evidence. So if indeed there was blood, that blood could have come from anybody. And then let's translate this back into a finance setting. So let's say it's a fact that your friend invested in cryptocurrency and made some money. Well, that could be consistent with one suspect, which is crypto is a great thing to invest in, or another suspect, which is your friend just got lucky. And we will typically try to highlight whatever interpretation we want. So we're somebody who's like excited by anything new. We think, well, crypto is a great thing. Just like if you're a police officer who doesn't like that particular suspect, you'll interpret every piece of fact as evidence in favour of that suspect, even if it's consistent with alternative ones.
How does that make you feel about crypto?
I was about to say, I wish you told me this like 6 years ago. I would have listened to a lot of my friends and bought like a lot of coins that did not do very well. But I worked in crypto for about 5 years. So I feel like I sipped a bit of the crypto Kool-Aid and I kind of got fully into it. But I think it's because, like you say, evidence or facts, I knew a lot about the industry. Yeah. But also on my social media, because of my friends and like the people I worked with and like the people I associated with my network, everyone was like, crypto's amazing, it's going to the moon. So I kept on seeing reinforced data or reinforced truths that it was going to be a great investment. So I started buying lots of different coins when really I should have done a bit more research and not listened to what my friends were doing so much or my work colleagues and just focus on what I wanted to do. So do you feel that like you can be institutionalized when you have an abundance of like truths or facts or information about a certain subject?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not your fault. It's just that you're human. And what are you surrounded by? You're surrounded by lots of people saying the same thing. And this is not just due to the friends that you interacted with, but social media. So how do social media feeds work? They want to keep you on the platform. And how do they keep you on the platform? They do so by giving you the information that you want to be true. So if they see that you're connected to a lot of other people in crypto, they might think, hey, this guy T, he likes crypto, so let's show him more things which suggest that crypto is going to make money. Even if there are lots of other people who lost their shirt doing this, they're not going to show that to you. So this is why we have echo chambers. So what is an echo chamber? It's we see stuff which confirms what we want to be true. And this is based on humanity. So in our brains, we are wired in a way that if we see something we like, then it releases dopamine in our body. So it feels as good as having a drink with friends is to see something which just confirms your viewpoint. And this is how social media becomes so addictive. And this is why people keep scrolling and scrolling, is if you're somebody who might have a predilection for crypto, just show him more stuff which suggests that this is a good investment. And then you invest on the basis of this, not because you're foolish. You think that you're using information, but what you're given is only a selected part of the information. It's just like if there was a jury who only saw the case for the prosecution and not the defense, even if they're completely irrational people, they will still convict the person just because they've only seen one side.
Yeah, and the extent at which these social media platforms tailor the experience for the individual can make them feel like they're trying to seek out all the information. As an example, I've noticed in comment sections that the comments are now tailored to the individual. I don't think people realize this. When you expand a comment section on a video on YouTube, traditionally it was the most liked comments are at the top. Now it's not that, which suggests that the comments are different for every person that goes on. So every aspect of the engagement experience through a social media platform is being tailored to the individual. Yes. So really, you can't trust anything on there.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that about the comments, but that makes sense. So what I did know was actually not the content of the comment itself, but who comments. So if I see a comment and that comment is from somebody I follow as well, then that person's comment is more likely to be visible. So I support a football team, and then one of the players that I support. Well, why did you keep
missing it in the book?
It was too embarrassing. So Reading. So you would never support Reading.
It's not as bad as Arsenal.
Yeah, you didn't say Arsenal.
Well, you didn't say Arsenal at least.
Well, Arsenal might still be in existence next year. Reading might not be in existence. The owner tried to sell the training ground and break up the club. So I support this team, and so I follow quite a few of the players. And so it was a post on a completely different topic, but because this player had posted on it, then they displayed his comment. And again, it's that familiarity bias. So I'm more likely to trust his comment than a comment by somebody else. And so these platforms are really clever. One other thing that I know from the psychology literature, but I don't know whether these platforms have yet exploited. I hope they don't watch this and then start exploiting people, is that if I was to see a comment just by somebody called Alex or somebody who lives in Reading, then I will place more weight on that, even if I don't know that person, because I might have a natural connection to this. So there was a psychological study where there was an essay by somebody and they gave the person's details and they doctored it such that that person had the same birth date as the person in the experiment. And so just by having the same birthday, even though this was like something which was fake, they felt much more likely to like the particular essay just because they felt a particular connection. So there are ways of actually just creating some sort of a connection. And if you feel that you have a connection, even if somebody you've never met, just because they share your name or they share your birth or your hometown, you might be more willing to believe what they're saying.
Yeah, you can. You see that in your own personal life, don't you? If someone's like from the same area as you, you're like, I'm from Birmingham. Like, oh, Birmingham, and away you go. You know, it's that in.
Yeah.
It seems kind of mad that people will just believe the things that they see because they want to believe them. But then you gave some examples in your books of big scandals. There was Theranos, but then the more shocking one was the lady who pretended to have cancer, and so she gave all the money away to charity as well. I don't know if you want to tell the story. It might be better if you do, if you remember it.
Yeah, happy to do so. So this is the story of Belle Gibson. So she was an Australian influencer, and so she claimed to have cancer. And so she documented her story through Instagram, and she said that this cancer was something which is incurable. So she tried chemo, radiotherapy, none of this worked. But then she tried one final thing, which was basically willpower and clean eating. So she decided just to steel herself, to exercise, to eat healthily, and she apparently made a complete recovery. So this is linked to confirmation bias. Why? Because we want to believe that if you just want something, then you'll achieve it. We tell our kids you can do anything you put your mind to, and so if you're at death's door and you just want to live, we would like to believe that willpower would get you through. And also we like to believe that clean eating works, right? What's the solution to cancer? It's not the drugs in chemotherapy fabricated by some giant corporation, but something which is natural. And so people believed her, and unfortunately there were some patients who started just stopping chemotherapy to eat fruit and vegetables, and in one case, which I describe in the book, somebody died as a result of doing this. And what she'd done, she completely lied. So she never had cancer to begin with. And you would have thought, isn't it something that we should check? Well, if I am a cancer patient and I'm going to stop having chemotherapy for this remedy, this program which was suggested by an influencer, shouldn't there at least be some checking here? But no, because we wanted it to be true. This went viral. It was shared by so many people, just like the cryptocurrency idea was shared by a lot of your friends. And you think, well, I can't question this, right? If somebody claims to have cancer, I'm not going to ask her about it. And so this was just a single story where people really wanted it to be true and they were acting on the basis of this. And then it was found out that she was fraudulent.
Before I became a finance creator, I was a sales guy. And there was nothing more annoying than when you thought you'd landed a big deal, only for it to fall through basically when the customer found something in your vendor process that your company was missing, like providing compliance, things like GDPR, ISO 27001 or SOC 2. Showing your company has top-notch security practices is now essential if you're selling to bigger companies globally or if you're in SaaS, software as a service. This is where our partner Vanta comes in. Vanta automates compliance for ISO 27001 and many other major security acronyms which prove that your company is secure. They can save you loads of time and money and have over 7,000 clients, including big names like Cora and Flow Health. If you need better security compliance to land more deals, you can get $1,000 off by heading to vanta.com/makingmoney.
It's like the Emperor's New Clothes, like where everyone just kind of goes along with it because they don't want to be the person that goes, this is bullshit, or has anyone actually checked? Have you been affected by confirmation bias at all?
Unfortunately, yes. So a lot of the things that I write in the book, I say to myself as much as to other people. And this was one of the reasons why writing it, because supposedly, as a professor of finance who knows statistics and knows data, should I be immune? But I'm not. So I make a lot of mistakes. So one of them was when I heard about this 10,000 hours rule by Malcolm Gladwell. So I went to a talk at Wharton. So that was a business school in the US, which I used to teach at. And they had this great series called Peer Perspectives on Leadership, where some students who'd done some amazing things, would tell you about their life lessons. And so there was one guy who had been in Cirque du Soleil, so he was an amazing acrobat. And he talked about, well, how did he become able to do these one-armed handstands? It wasn't due to being born with some special gene or being double-jointed. He said it was practice. And he said, well, there is this 10,000 hours rule that if you practice something and you try hard enough, then you will become perfect at it. And again, that was consistent with what I've been brought up to be told, right? Practice makes perfect. You can do anything you put your mind to. And I didn't just take his word for it. I read Malcolm Gladwell's book, and this looked at all of the evidence behind this 10,000 hours rule. And then I started to teach it to my own students. So even though later on I found that this was not true, I taught it to my students because I said, look, you come to your MBA program, maybe your background is not in finance, but this is something where you can reinvent yourself and learn something new. And I just get nods every time I spoke, as if this 10,000 hours rule was a truth university acknowledge. But then a few years later, when I moved back to the UK, I started this part-time job at Gresham College. So this is an unusual institution. You can't get a degree there. They just give free lectures to the public, like Michael Faraday gave on science. And perhaps the most famous Gresham professor recently is Sir Chris Whitty, so the chief medical officer who helped us fight the pandemic. At the same time, he was giving free lectures on epidemiology through Gresham College. And so I wanted to give a lecture on the growth mindset, the idea that if you work at something, you'll do better. And so I went back to the Outliers book and just read it a little bit more carefully. And I realised that the evidence did not support anything that he was claiming. So there was no mention anywhere of 10,000 hours in the underlying paper. There was no mention or measure of success. And also the study was purely on violinists. So what leads to success in violin playing might not lead to success in completely other fields. So he just extrapolated from this one particular study and then used that to claim this universal rule and fooled even people like me. And so it was my fault for having just believed this without being as critical as I was the second time round.
How did it make you feel?
So I first just felt rather embarrassed about this. And I thought, well, is it actually not too bad? Because the general idea that practice makes perfect, isn't that a good thing to get out? Does it matter if something is completely 100% accurate? But I think it still matters, because one of the problems with the 10,000 hours rule is it suggests that what matters is the quantity of practice, right? So just like we like to gamify everything, we want 10,000 steps at the end of the day. Can we quantify the number of hours that we do? And so let's say you want to become a great tennis player. I used to just knock the ball around with my friends and just play in that way. But actually that's very different to playing a game just and keeping score, because you're playing a game and keeping score. You're not going to whack the ball as hard as possible. You're going to do something a bit more sensible with a greater percentage chance of being in. You're going to practice serving, which many people just don't like to practice. They just like to hit the ball out of their hands. So it's quite different from being in a more difficult, challenging situation rather than knocking the ball around. Going back to music, there's a difference between a jam session and a deliberate rehearsal where you're trying to work for a particular goal.
But with bias, does it make sense if something seems logical? Does it always have to seem logical? So, for example, if you do 10,000 hours of playing football or tennis, you're going to get better you're going to be better. If I try and learn like Japanese for 10,000 hours, I already speak French. I was going to say French. I might already speak French. If I don't learn like something...
If you learn Japanese for 10,000 hours, end up speaking French, so it's gone wrong.
but shouldn't it be something believable? Because you said you found it a bit embarrassed, but it is quite believable that 10,000 hours you should get
Surely
better
practice does make you better.
Yeah, so because it's so logical, you don't really question it.
Yeah.
And again, practice does make you better to some degree. So I think the general idea is still holds that practice is useful, but the idea that it's just the quantity of practice that matters, or you can't be successful unless you've put a lot of time in. So why did that message also resonate? Because when we look at really successful people, we like to believe that they had to get there through a lot of sweat and grit and hard work, when actually sometimes they can be people who are naturals, right? If you do something that you are naturally talented at, that is perhaps better than trying to always struggle to get to the top. But we like books with like single explanations. So we say this is the one way to become successful, when it's a myriad of things. So practice still works, but just to practice and think that I could become sort of a pop star right now if I just work on my singing, that is completely implausible. Instead, yes, you can branch out into other things if you put the time in, but they still have to be related to your core strengths and your core competencies. And again, this is one of the problems where people get excited with crypto or any type of investing just because it's a fad without past experience in it. They're not really looking at the importance of expertise, not just passion.
But what if the bias is if it's something that's not true? So for example, like smoking back in the day, I was looking at like old school smoking adverts and they said like 20,000 physicians say Lucky Strike are less irritating for your throat. They're good for, they help you with your cough. And then it said like most doctors, Camels are the number one choice of cigarette for doctors. So like these adverts, everyone thought that smoking was like really good for you. They were like, oh, man up, have a cigarette. Like you're coughing. Oh, go on, have a cigarette. So that was completely wrong. Does that still count as unconscious bias if the facts are not true?
If you've been lied to.
If you've been lied to, but everyone thinks it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. It still counts as bias, and that played into the bias at that particular time. So smoking was seen as a sign of sophistication, and so that's a sign of something that was good to do. And so this is why people wanted to start to smoke, because that played with the biases at the time. Right now, there's different biases and different things which are seen as sophisticated, but the key for people being successful is to try to figure out what that bias is and play into that bias. And so the key for us is if something is playing into what we want to be true, then perhaps we should be a bit more critical and discerning about it.
So one thing that concerns me is these bias that seem like they're common sense and they seem like they're good for people, and that most people would say them with not bad intentions. For example, I worry then that saying buying a global index fund long term is a good thing to do. How do I check that that is actually the case?
Yeah. So what I do is I look at long-term data. So I'd look at the data on, number one, equities versus treasury bills. And it's absolutely the case in certain years, then equities could go down significantly. But in the long term, equities will outperform any other type of investment, such as treasury bills. Second, you'd like to look at an index fund in particular versus actively managed funds. And it's actually true, absolutely true, that some actively managed funds might do well in particular years. But again, if you look at long-term evidence, the evidence that active always outperforms passive is pretty weak. Actually, if anything, passive performs better once you take fees into account.
Yeah. So would you say then that because then we have the past performance is no indicator of future performance, we extrapolate out over 100 years of data.
Yeah.
Is that enough to sit there and say confidently that is a fact then? That this is the best way to invest for most people?
Yes, I think it is. So this is something where you're looking.
My whole career's built off this, so thank fuck for that.
So what's the difference between a fact and data? A fact will be in this one particular year, this one particular index fund beat an actively managed fund. But data is if you look at hundreds of different years and lots of different funds, both active and passive. And so there you're having large scale data, and then that will amount to evidence. Notice that you can never prove something with 100% certainty, because even if you have 100 data points, it could have been that those years got lucky, but it's much less likely to be the case once you've got 100 years. Just like if I was to toss a coin 100 times and it was heads for all those 100 times, that doesn't prove that the coin was biased. It could still be unbiased and it just went on some amazing streak. So that's why I rarely use the word proof. But we often will, when we have more data and that data is over a greater time period and it uses more funds, then it will amount to something which is closer to evidence. And again, this is what we have in a criminal trial. Like, we can't prove that somebody's guilty, but we need to have proof beyond reasonable doubt rather than 100% certainty. And I think this is what we want to have for investing decisions. Because one critique of my book is that if my standard for proof is so high, then you'll never do anything. Right? You can never show anything. You never will know how to improve a skill. You never think of any way to eat more healthily or to exercise. But the bar should not be 100%, right? Perfect is not the enemy of good. What I'm suggesting is let's not waste our money on some bad investment ideas or waste our time pursuing something that we might not be good at. Instead, is there some threshold level of confidence which will allow us to take a particular action, even that threshold is not 100%.
Have you got some practical steps? I know you outline them in your book, but so that someone doesn't have to be an academic to peer review things, that they could go, I've consumed this piece of information, I'm now going to do this checklist of things to make sure that it's accurate.
Absolutely. I think this is really important because when the general listener thinks, okay, this is a book about statistics, but I just don't have the time to check the statistics of everything. And my background is not in statistics. And mine is not either. Well, I don't have a PhD in statistics or an A-level in statistics. There is not a single equation in the whole book. So what's important is that there's simple questions you can ask yourself which don't involve any equations. So the first is, if you hear something, do I want it to be true? So if you want it to be true, then you are more likely to have your biases at play, and probably other people want it to be true as well. So the reason why you see it in your social media feed is that other people have retweeted it or shared it, and that's why you're seeing it. The second is, well, let's look at what is the evidence behind it and how large scale is that evidence. So if it's one person or a group of people invested in cryptocurrency and made money over 6 months, that is different from a large scale study looking at thousands of people who invested in cryptocurrency over many, many years. Also, there's the issue of correlation versus causation. So if you see a particular result, imagine that there was the opposite result and see whether you would attack that. So let's give a concrete example. So a lot of my work is on sustainable investing. I love to believe that sustainable companies perform better. And so there's a study which shows that sustainable companies have better performance. I'd like to believe that sustainability causes that better performance. But let me try and think, well, what might the alternative suspects be? And to do that, let me imagine I had the opposite result. So maybe more sustainable companies perform worse. So how would I try to knock that down? I don't like that result. So I might appeal to alternative explanations. So maybe these sustainable companies had bad managers, and bad managers are just distracted from the bottom line. So they're investing in random things like sustainability. And those bad managers also lead to the bad performance. So now that I've pinpointed an alternative suspect, which is management, which is driving the performance, ask myself, does that alternative suspect still apply, even though the results are in the direction that I want them to be? So maybe why is there a link between good sustainability and good performance? Maybe a great manager causes their company to be sustainable and also causes the company to perform well.
And this prevalence of seeking out information that you want. It's in your book. You show the story, your own personal. You were very honest. It was probably my favourite story of a fund manager who got in touch, who then said, "I want you to help me find an angle." And what they meant was research all areas of sustainability and find an aspect that we can kind of build a fund around.
Yeah.
Female managers, black leaders within businesses, something, and you found nothing, right? You told them that, and you openly admit that if you'd have found something, it would have changed your life. So you wanted to find something.
Yes.
And then a few months later, they'd set up a fund with someone else that did find them something, even though there wasn't anything.
Yeah, so let's tell that story, and I'm really glad that you liked it. So it's one that was personally costly to me, but I think hopefully the findings are instructive. So I'd written a paper previously showing that the 100 best companies to work for in America, companies that treat their employees really well, outperform over a 28-year period. And treating your employees well leads to better performance. And so there's this famous fund manager, so let me call her Jinyi. She wanted to launch a fund on gender diversity. So clearly as an ethnic minority, diversity is something I care a lot about, and I was just really flattered that this is one of the leading fund managers in the world wanted to work with me. So she said, well, can you do a similar study, not looking at employee satisfaction in general, but diversity in particular? And so I said, yeah, let me rerun this. And actually there were 24 different measures of gender diversity available. You can look at the percentage of women in the boardroom, the percentage of women in the wider workforce, the gender pay gap, so many of those other things. And so I ran that data 24 times. And then I was disappointed that 22 of them were negatively related to performance. But there were 2 that were positively related. One of them was weak, but the other one of them was strong. It's statistically significant. And what that means is it's strong enough to be most likely not due to just luck or chance. So it's clear what I should do if I wanted to work with Jinyi. I should just only report that one significant result, or maybe I'd report the 2, one significant and one insignificant, and say, oh, look, I'm being honest. I'm going to show you the insignificant one as well. But that wouldn't be honest because I had run 24 different tests. So I showed her all 24, 2 positive, 22 negative. She was disappointed, but she graciously thanked me and said, okay, you've tried, but the evidence is not there. And so I just put this in the filing cabinet. I'd done research before, and I know that as a researcher, sometimes you try to find something and it's just not there. So I moved back to another project. And then 6 months later, as you say, Damien, I was shocked to find on my LinkedIn feed that Jinyi had launched this gender diversity fund based on the idea that there's a proven relationship between gender diversity and financial performance. So I thought, well, how could this be? Because I'd done the data and I found nothing. And she'd found some study by some other company which measured diversity and performance in really weird ways, thrown away half of the data and found some positive result. So this is the problem of data mining, right? If there is a view that you want to be true, you can almost always search for evidence to support that. So how would you measure gender diversity? It could be 3 or more women, or it could be 2 or more women, or over half the board could be women. How do you measure financial performance? You could look at stock returns or profitability or sales. You can measure these things in so many different ways, and you'll almost always be able to find one result that works. You parade that one particular result, and you hide all the others. And if it's a result that people want to be true, they won't question how many other tests did you do and they didn't work.
And do you know how the fund's doing?
Yeah, so this fund is underperformed, and actually in general what people have found is that gender funds underperform. And so this is not something that people want to be true, because most of us are real diversity advocates. But I think it makes sense. Why? Because what matters for a company, it's not just demographic diversity, but general cognitive diversity, right? Diverse teams make better decisions, but the idea of reducing a person's humanity to just their gender and ethnicity, that suggests as a white male, you can never add diversity to an organisation, when it could be you're from a different socioeconomic background, maybe your background is humanities, everybody else there is scientists. And also what matters is not just diversity, but also equity and inclusion. It's not enough just to bring in a mix of people and just to let them do their thing. What is the company doing to ensure that people are willing to speak up, speak out about things like, say, Silicon Valley Bank or the financial crisis, highlight problems in the strategy and be heard rather than dismissed? It goes beyond just the box-ticking measures that are often used in these simple studies.
I'm going to tell you about today's video sponsor, Manual, from the privacy of my own studio, because T loves rinsing me about my hair, but actually he's having a harder time of it recently. When we first started filming the podcast, my hair was noticeably thinning. The difference from then to today has been a result of me using Manual consistently now for about 12 months or so. It's really easy. You just go onto the website, fill out the questionnaire, and they will send you clinically proven treatments for preventing hair loss straight to your front door. No need for an appointment or to even leave the house. Receding hairlines are something that millions of men are affected by, and there's no shame in going bald, if that's your thing. But I got a head shaped like a Cadbury's cream egg, so you know, I'm fighting for every follicle. If you want to join the fight, then you can sign up using the link below, and if you use the code MM55, that's MM55 at the checkout, you'll get 55% off your first order.
The research company that found this thesis that it was based on, have they raised their profile at all? Has it done good for them to do that?
Absolutely. So this company I just anonymise in the book, but actually since then, and I can say this because I've written publicly about this organisation, McKinsey, they've released 4 studies.
McKinsey?
Which claim, no, McKinsey's a different one which was used in the book. So separately from the studies that Shinny was using, McKinsey themselves have released 4 different reports claiming that diversity improves financial performance. So the errors have been pointed out to these people, yet they keep doubling down and releasing more reports which have the same errors. And they say we're going to use the exact same methodology as in the past for consistency. When diversity is the idea of changing what you're doing. If you learn that there's a mistake in it, then rather than burying our head in the sand, let's try to improve on this. And McKinsey's reputation has been hugely enhanced. Why? Because they're being seen as a beacon for diverse thinking. When there's scandals such as Purdue Pharma and the opioid epidemic, then if you're saying, well, we're pro-diversity, this is great. The lead author of this is now made a dame. And so she's been given a damehood for services to diversity.
You could have been a dame.
That would have been good. But had I worked with Shinyi, then this would have been launching a fund with one of the leading investors in the world.
Is that frustrating for you? Because basically they misrepresent the data and then they get the outcome still?
Well, it is frustrating, but I just have to be realistic that this is just life. Is that in many life decisions that there's what is right and there's what's going to be successful. And if you look at this, it's not just Shinyi and her fund, right? There's lots of books out there right now which will over extrapolate from a couple of ideas. I mentioned a few in my book. So Start With Why by Simon Sinek has been hugely successful. Some of these Malcolm Gladwell books, a lot of them will misrepresent the data. And like in their defense, I don't think that they're bad people. So they're not necessarily misrepresenting stuff. If they have a strong viewpoint, they might think, well, I passionately believe that diversity works, and maybe these data points were just unlucky. Here's the one true data point. And just like you might have that with Simon Sinek, he thinks, oh, I really believe that starting with Y leads to success, so let me handpick a few organisations that started with Y and became successful.
Can we be too obsessed with data though, in the sense of like it prevents us from starting, it prevents us from just getting going and getting the outcomes that we want?
Yeah, because there's lots of decisions in life that we don't make based on data, right? Who do you choose? How do you choose who to marry? You don't just look at your future partner's earnings potential. There's hopefully other things which enter into that situation, that decision. How do you choose whether to take your son to football or rugby? You don't look at the evidence for whether football or rugby is better for future physical fitness or networking and job opportunities. Your son may just love to play rugby. So where I think we should be discerning about data are decisions taken on the basis of data. So if people say, let's invest in diverse companies because we're going to magically improve financial performance because of these McKinsey studies, I will say, take a step back. Do the McKinsey studies actually show there's a strong evidence here, or is it just correlation without causation? But if you were to support a diversity initiative on something else, which is to say, I just think diversity is the right thing to do. I'm not doing this to make more money. I think it's morally and ethically right to have a diverse company. That is something which is quite different. And so there's many decisions that we can make not based on data. But the concern that I have here is that we are often justifying many things, investment decisions, personal choice decisions based on data. And if we're doing that, we need to make sure that that data is accurate rather than feeding into our confirmation bias.
One way to do that is to seek out the other side. Do you have any tips on how people can do that? Because I find that difficult to dig into the realms of the people that disagree with me, say.
Well, absolutely. And why you find it difficult, again, it's not you're a bad person, you're a human, right? So going back to the brain, I mentioned that you release dopamine when you see something you like. If you see something you don't like, this activates the amygdala. So that's the part of the brain that induces a fight or flight response. So seeing a different viewpoint is a bit like being attacked by a tiger. We don't like it. This is why it's uncomfortable. And again, this is something that I suffered from myself, and I had to really try to overcome my biases. So when there was the Brexit referendum, I was a very strong Remainer. I like to believe that anybody who is a Brexiter was just racist or xenophobic or uninformed. All my circle of friends that I grew up with and were now on my social media feeds, they were all Remainers as well. So I deliberately went to a Brexiter talk, and I was just shocked that this was really logical. Like, there's lots of logical arguments that he was using. Even if I did not agree with his conclusion that he reached, I could still see the logic behind this. And to date, this is still the most eye-opening talk that I've ever seen. And so even now, I subscribe to both the Telegraph and the Guardian, so arguably the most left-wing and right-wing mainstream newspapers within the UK, to make sure that I try to see the both sides of every issue.
And how can people do that within content and stuff? That's where the algorithm's pushing them a narrative, do you have any ways of doing that online?
Yeah, so it's just you have to actively search for stuff, because if you're going to be passive and just to scroll through social media, they will just give you what you like. So I have to actively choose to sign up for The Guardian and also for The Telegraph, and also not just do this to tick a box and to say in podcast interviews, hey, I've signed up to both, but actually try to read them. And sometimes if there are articles where I just don't like the sound of, I will read this. And it's not so much being open-minded, but being selfish, because I often talk about the value of sustainability. I've just come back from Oslo and Frankfurt, where I gave talks on the power of sustainability, but I want to know what the sustainability detractors have to say about it. Why? Because I'll get Q&A at the end and people will ask me questions. Hey, have you thought about this potential hole in your argument? So if I've seen the other side, that now means that I'm able to give a stronger argument and a stronger talk myself. So this is something just in my own self-interest to make sure that I'm trying to learn about the counter-arguments.
What do you think about the sustainability counter-arguments?
So it depends on what the idea of what's behind the counter-argument. So if the counter-argument is based on this idea that I think climate change is a hoax, that is something where my understanding of the scientific evidence is this is pretty much one-sided and pretty much conclusive. So when I say the importance of seeing both sides, it doesn't mean that in every single issue there are both sides, right? So something like smoking, something like climate change, those things I see as pretty one-sided. But what I see as being more two-sided is what to do about climate change. So some people think, well, the best thing to do is, as an investor, to sell all of our fossil fuel stocks. But that might not be the most effective, because you can only sell if somebody else buys, might it be better for you to hold those fossil fuel stocks and engage with the company to make sure that they're decarbonising and developing renewable energy rather than dumping it? It's just a bit like if I was to try to clean up the trash in my garden by throwing it over the neighbour's fence. That doesn't make anything better. This just passes the problem to something else. And also, when I look at the other side, is what might be the consequences of too rapid action on climate change. So if you're to close all coal-fired power stations, there might be a 55-year-old coal worker who can't retrain. Now, because I live in my nice bubble, I don't know any 55-year-old coal workers, and so that's not something that I'm going to be taking into account. A few months ago, I was at the World Economic Forum in Dubai, and this is not just shameless sort of name dropping, but why I mentioned this is we were discussing climate change and a just transition, and a woman got up and she said, I'm from Africa. In Africa, 600 million people do not have access to electricity. So if we are to cut all of these energy sources, you're going to deny us electrification, which is one huge reason for why the West has improved in terms of economic development. And for me, I've never known anybody without any electricity. So for me, the other side is not necessarily the other side of the science and climate change, because my reading is this is pretty conclusive. But the other side in terms of the trade-offs, the coal workers, the people without electricity who might lose if we have too one-sided a decarbonisation strategy.
And what do you think in terms of the argument that the things that people think are green are not, that it's just about money? You wrote an article called The End of ESG, I think. I've been critical of ESG and the greenwashing within that.
Yes.
You know, like, where do you sit with that kind of side of things?
Yeah, so that's to highlight that it's actually really difficult to have a black and white or brown and green view as to what is truly sustainable, because some things which on the face of it might be seeming as extremely sustainable might not be. So let's think of biofuel, so biomass. There, if you're just cutting down some forests and just replacing it by one particular culture, that will reduce biodiversity. So in order to grow something like biomass, that can have negative alternative environmental effects. And sometimes there are some companies on the flip side which might be seen as polluting, but they're not. So I've been working with Royal London Asset Management for 8 years. I'm one of the members of their Responsible Investment Committee. And we took out a portfolio and we ran this through a tool which tells you which are the worst offenders in terms of climate change. And they said, your worst stock is a semiconductor company. Why? Well, when you manufacture semiconductors, the manufacturing process releases perfluorocarbons to the atmosphere. This is really bad in terms of trapping in heat. This is even worse than carbon dioxide. Yet semiconductors could be the solution to global warming because they could be used in solar panels. So if you just look at just the production process, how polluting is that, without looking at what the good is used for, then you only are looking at one part of the picture. And unfortunately, some of these taxonomies, some of these classifications, they will only look at one aspect and not the others. And that's why it's really difficult to have this view as to what is truly green. So I think why you have this pushback for ESG, again, it's healthy. They are sometimes quite evangelical and quite restrictive as to what counts as green or brown. They're not looking at the bigger picture.
What about things like electric cars? Like there's a huge push in the world to make cars electric, but a lot of them are running on like coal or like fossil fuels, or like in America, they've got these big diesel generators that run the charging stations for the electric cars.
Yeah.
How is it that it's gone through so many governments that electric cars are good when like lithium batteries like are really hard to dispose of and like there's a lot of fossil fuels being used? That's I guess an unconscious bias, but the people in government should know that we're not producing clean energy to run these electric cars. So how does something like that get into such a big scale?
You're absolutely right, but why something like that gets to such a large scale and becomes so popular is we like to look at one single explanation. So this is a bias in the book I call black and white thinking. We like to see something as being unequivocally good or unequivocally bad. So it might be like clean eating is always good, or practice is always good, even though you're focusing on quantity, not quality. And similarly here, we might see electric cars are always good. That leads to a very simple strategy if you're the government, which is let's try to produce as many electric cars as possible. You've got some key performance indicators and you can say to your electorate, look, we've increased electric vehicle uptake by this amount, we've subsidised electric cars with all of these tax subsidies, when actually not all electric cars are the same. So there might be some which are better than others in terms of their efficiency. It may well be that where is the lithium coming from? Is this coming from mining? And that's something which is hugely destructive to the environment. It may well be that if the batteries are very heavy and the braking leads to particulates leaking into the atmosphere and causing local pollution, that's a negative as well. well. So I'm an electric car owner. I bought my first ever car. It's a fourth-hand electric car, so it's truly sustainable.
What type is it?
It's a Renault Zoe. I just bought it off some friends who were moving back to France, and so rather than them scrapping it or reselling it, we thought we should just buy it. So I'm somebody who wants this to be true. So I'm not an anti-electric car person, but there's also a big difference between buying a new electric car where you're adding cars to the circulation. So there's evidence suggesting that every one new car bought adds to the total stock of cars by about 0.75. So it's not one for one, but it's one for 0.75. Whereas for me, buying an existing electric car, that's something where I'm not adding to the stock of cars, and so that's why that's something I thought
How's
was
the battery
good
on
for
it?
us. So it's, well, we just live in Wimbledon, and most of the commuting is around there. But we're going to make our first trip to Legoland actually this weekend.
So what I want to bring this back to finance. I want to bring it back to people, because you have already touched on this, and you said, most people are not statisticians. Are there other tips that you've got for avoiding common biases that people fall over with their finances? Any others that you think we've not explored?
So I think I've explored the main one, which is just to question everything. So what is really interesting is that people are already able to have discernment when they see something that they don't like. So if I was to publish a study on LinkedIn saying sustainability reduces returns or diversity reduces returns, you will see no shortage of comments as to, well, how did they measure diversity? How did they measure returns? This is just one study, or maybe the study was only in this one particular time period. So this is why the tool I mentioned earlier of imagining the opposite is so useful, because by imagining the opposite and giving the result that people don't want, then they are able then to come up with a lot of the potential concerns that they might have. So what I'm trying to highlight is the solution to misinformation is already within you. Again, you don't need to suddenly get a PhD in statistics. You don't suddenly need to read an entire paper and look through all the footnotes, which again, people just don't have the time for. Again, people are already, with their natural discernment, able to come up with some concerns when they see a headline that they don't like. So just like try to flip the headline to seeing something you don't like, and that will trigger your amygdala, that will trigger the fight or flight response and give you some sort of impetus to come up with some reasons to try to strike it down.
When people have those responses, that's kind of when they should be leaning in then, really.
Yes.
When you have that natural, oh, this makes me feel great, this headline, that's when you should be questioning it. And when you're pushing away from something because you disagree with it, you should maybe spend some time researching it, is what you're saying.
Exactly. So this for me was the Brexit talk, is that, should I go to this? And let me not give myself too much credit. So the reason why I went to that Brexit talk wasn't I actively, deliberately wanted to see Brexiters. It was a reunion for my university. And so that reunion would have some free canapes and champagne. I'd see some of my friends, and I saw this was a Brexit talk, and I thought, okay, should I really be going to this? And I thought, okay, maybe I should. I want to become a bit more informed about the issue, but it was that plus the fact that it was a reunion event for university, and that combination just encouraged me to go along, and I tried to go along open-mindedly. So yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm going to enjoy the champagne afterwards, but now that I'm here, let me be open-minded for that particular talk. So I think it's something I had to force myself to do.
That's such a powerful example, because I mean, obviously I was a Remainer. I hope no one cancels me. But I saw the same thing. All my friends in London were like, yeah, Remain. And then the only thing I heard from Brexit side was, oh, the NHS is going to get loads of money. And I was like, oh, that didn't turn out to be true. Oh, they don't know what they're talking about. But I probably should have gone to a Brexit talk. Just like in America, people who don't like Trump are never going to go to a Trump rally. But you're saying that you should probably look at both sides so you can get all the information and have a more logical, grounded argument.
And then to know how then best to win the votes from the other sides. Because one of the phrases which I think is associated sadly with Hillary Clinton was she called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. So if you believe that these supporters are sort of lesser people, that you're not even going to try to understand what their concerns are, then it's less likely that you're going to be appealing to them as voters.
I mean, politics is an interesting example, because I think people get quite tribal and they really struggle to look at the other side, and they think that the people on the other side must be idiots or evil. It's very extreme, isn't it? How do people counter that? That it's hard to look at someone else who you disagree with.
And what's interesting is the phrase that we use, the other side, and it's not just a phrase that you're using, Damien, everybody uses it. I use that phrase. And so we think that if they're on the other side for us, they have different objectives for us. When actually Brexiters, like Remainers, wanted the best for Britain. right? They wanted Britain to be a great country. They just thought there's a different way to achieve that. So it's not like a football match where you literally have the other side, you're going for different goals. Here it might be that you're going for the same goal, but you have different tactics. So it might be just having a discussion in the locker room. Should we play a more direct style or more passing style? There we can have a reasonable discussion rather than cancelling somebody else another side. And so if we were to discuss something like climate change and then another investor was saying, well, hey, I don't necessarily think it's best for me to dump all my fossil fuel stocks. I think it's better for me to then buy these companies and engage with those firms. Often that person might be called a climate change denier, or they might be accused of greenwashing and not being truly sustainable. But let's sort of hold back the accusations and see, well, is this person after the same objective as us, which is a greener planet, but they're thinking about different ways to achieve this. So we often conflate two things, which is the goal with the approach. If somebody suggests something we don't like, we think they have a different goal from us. They want to have a warmer planet, or they're anti-DEI, when maybe they actually have a different approach to achieve that same goal.
So ask the question of what outcome do they want? And often you'll find it's the same as you. They're just approaching it from a slightly different angle.
Absolutely. And to try to highlight any commonality before you start having the disagreement. So one of the most influential books that I've read is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And he often highlights how we argue against people. And often we're talking at cross purposes. There's often far less misalignment than you think. So try to highlight what are the things that you agree with, start with that common ground, and then you can go to your disagreements. And often those disagreements will be disagreements to achieve a shared goal rather than to achieve different goals, and that leads to a much more cohesive and constructive conversation.
What about in arenas though where they try to polarize, like politics? They almost it seems that they come with agendas. The politicians they present data in a way that tries to rip people apart.
Yes. And they will do that deliberately, because I think the more polarising you are, the more you can say it's us against them. You can get some voters then to be sceptical about the other side. So this goes back to the article, The End of ESG, that you mentioned earlier, Damien. So why did I write an article called The End of ESG when I am an ESG advocate and a sustainability advocate? Well, here, the article was called The End of ESG as a term, not as a practice. So I'm absolutely about investors thinking long-term when they invest, companies making long-term investments in their corporate culture, in decarbonisation. But if you call it ESG, unfortunately, this leads to some just provocative reaction. So people think, okay, if I'm a Republican, I should be against this, when creating long-term profits should be a completely Republican value. So I thought, well, let's move away from this ESG term, which rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, has become politicized, and instead think about how do we create long-term value, which is something that everybody, Democrats and Republicans, should be embracing.
Call it sustainable value instead of ESG.
Absolutely. And sustainable value, what does sustainable mean? Long-term value. Shouldn't any Republican want to be long-term greedy and make long-term profits? Yes. Shouldn't any Democrat want to create long-term value? Absolutely. And also this means within an organization, it's not just for somebody whose job is ESG specialist or ESG manager. Even if your job is chief financial officer or chief executive officer, you should be embracing these sustainability issues. Why? Because this improves long-term company performance. Again, one of the problems with ESG is not just the political polarization, but it's often seen as niche within a company. I can just farm this out to the ESG department, and then the real business people can deal with real business issues, but that's not the way of thinking.
It should be ingrained in the company. It should be part of the business.
Absolutely. So to me, the ESG movement has won when ESG is no longer
it's just a standard.
Yeah. It's just how you do business. Yeah.
You find that though. So speaking to Vanguard in the past, they have these sustainability departments within every fund, and they're pressurizing businesses because a lot of the businesses that are in the ESG funds are in the main index.
Yes,
they might strip out guns, But I find that a lot of it is just so that they can charge a few extra basis points. Vegan burgers, right? It's like KFC they don't start offering vegan burgers because they want to sell less chickens. They just think we can charge a nice high price for the vegan burgers.
Yeah.
So can we apply a similar framework then to someone who goes, I want to be an ethical investor. Oh, there's an ESG fund. That makes them feel good inside. But how do they actually go about this process of going, is this what I want? Is this actually ethical?
Well, I think one thing you'd want to look at is what are the top holdings in that portfolio. So one of the concerns of greenwashing is that you can have some funds which claim to be ESG, but if you were to look at the particular holdings within, this doesn't necessarily suggest actually this doesn't look like a fund which is investing in companies that create value for wider society. I would also still look at the general thing that a fund needs to deliver, which is long-term financial performance. So why am I investing? It might be for my future or for my son's future. So therefore financial returns are going to be absolutely paramount. And if there's a fund which has made lots of financial returns, it should not be embarrassed about that. Those financial returns are not at the expense of ESG. Those financial returns are because they've invested in companies that have done really well and grown and created a lot of value for wider society. So I would, rather than just looking at just the traditional ESG label, whether your fund has ESG or sustainable in your name, what are the actual holdings that you have? What is your long-term financial performance? You could then, if you wanted to, look at some specific ESG actions, which are sometimes funds list the companies they engaged in and what they try to get that company to do. So is it to phase out plastic packaging, or is this to treat employees better and invest more in human capital, and look at those. But I think what matters much more is actions rather than claims and labels.
Okay, thank you. T, how are you going to approach this now with crypto? Oh, I'm interested. Because you're pretty bullish.
I was very bullish on crypto. I'm still we're all record heights now, so I'm pretty happy.
Still bullish.
I'm still pretty bullish. I think we still got room to go. But since we started this podcast, I've consolidated my crypto portfolio, diversified into things a bit more stable. But now I think I'm just just looking at data and like doing research and then asking the question, flipping it around and then like kind of looking into the source of the data. It's not always easy to look into the source of the report or the data or the survey, whatever, but I think a bit more due diligence. Yeah,
like in my own research that I do, I'll often have a topic in mind and I want to talk about it and I want there to be something interesting. And when I stumble across that, I get a rush. I'm like, yes, there it is. Here's the bit of the content that's interesting. A recent example was I looked at, was it possible to build retirement portfolios in later life? So a common thing is people thinking, oh God, I've started too late, right? So I looked at data from, I think it was the ONS and they just basically tracked the savings amounts of individuals. And obviously if you have a steady savings amount from the age of 20 to 50, that's optimal. But a lot of people have kids and stuff, and they plotted what a savings rate could look like for someone who had kids, who had a retirement break. And they showed that in terms of spending over a lifetime, it might actually be optimal to load all your savings at the end. So this is interesting because people who are in their 40s, it might actually be the best thing to not save in their 30s from lifetime spending. This made me excited. I make the video thinking now I should probably go and look at other arguments against that, rather than thinking, oh, that supports that's going to make my viewers happy. Yes. That's good evidence. Make the video, off I go.
Yes, and I think this is really interesting because, even though I'm someone who believes in the power of data and evidence, that's my day job. Data and evidence is only something you get from looking at the average person, right? So you look at thousands of people and say, on average, how should you be saving? But something which might be true for one particular circumstance might not be true for other circumstances. So different people might have kids at different times in their life. It might be that their careers are on different trajectories. So my career as a finance professor, you get pretty much paid the same from when you're, say, 30 to 70. Whereas another career, let's say investment banking, you get paid less at the start and it goes up a lot at the end. So what matters is not only who are the people surveyed or who are the people in the study, but how similar are they, not in terms of having the same name or the same birthday, but in terms of relevant stuff, in terms of similar financial and life situation to you.
And the curve, what are the extreme ends? And there might be one person on there that's saved 10 million quid at the age of 60 in 1 year, and they've just dragged the average up, the mean or whatever. Yeah.
And they're not representative, which is again why we don't want to look at single anecdotes of this person did this, but what does the large scale data show? But this is large scale data which might be relevant for your particular situation.
I think the thing I want people to take away from this conversation, the real actionable step is, if you want something to be true and it makes you feel good, you should probably stop at that moment and go, okay, I need to look at the other side of this. I need to go and find someone who disagrees with this point. And if we look at the examples of people getting rich quick from crypto trading or FX trading, you need to then go look at all of the people that are putting 15 hours a day in and losing all their money.
But they're normally a lot quieter. You don't see them on Instagram being like, I just lost 50 grand in crypto.
Well, that's because they're there. You can find that content. Yeah, it's there. Of course it is.
It's just not being shown to me.
Well, in the same way with the comments that I've raised before, the comments that disagree with my point in a video will be downvoted by the audience that are loyal to me.
Yes.
So they'll be right at the bottom of the thing.
Yes.
It's like kind of like the dragnet with search content. You know, they get forced to the bottom. So if you want to see, if you go onto a YouTube video and you want to see the counter arguments or the people that disagree, go scroll to the bottom of the comments and they're all there because they're downvoted by the people who agree with the person, you know?
Yeah, so you have to be active about it. Again, passively, you won't see it because of how the algorithms work. So it might be that you'd have to search for something like why crypto is a bubble right now, or 10 reasons to try to look for something like that. And so actively search for some counter arguments. And it might be after reading those counter arguments, you still think actually crypto is the right thing to do, and that's fine. So you've then reached the decision after looking at both sides, just like a jury could still choose to convict after hearing the case for the defence, but the jury still has to hear that case before they're making the decision.
The most common one that I hear touted, especially around the FIRE community, is the 4% rule from the Trinity study, and how this thing of if you get a portfolio, you can draw 4% of it a year and it'll last forever. That isn't what the study said, and it measured retirement savings beyond 65 for a period of say 10 to 20 years when retirements were that, not this idea that you could retire at 30 with £1 million and draw 40 grand a year. Actually, depending on results, it could be 5%, it could be 3%. It's very nuanced, but these things take hold. And I see people all the time on finance channels going, 4%, whatever you earn, times that by 25, and that's what you need for retirement. Kind of isn't the case.
Yeah, so if you said your biggest takeaway was to try and imagine the other side and look for counter arguments. I think so then the second biggest takeaway is if you see something, think, well, does this actually apply to me? Because we love to have these one size fits all rules, right? 10,000 hours for everybody, when actually you might not need that if you're naturally talented at something. This idea of having a 4-hour work week or a 4-hour body, and now this 4% rule, well, that will depend on whether you're going to retire at 30 or retire at 70. It will depend on your planned income and your habits and your lifestyle at retirement. So something which sounds one size fits all, well, look, does that apply to my particular situation? And it may well be that this data, this rule was devised on other people, and it's not applicable to you.
It's always the case, I think, that fixed rules tend to not work for everyone. You know, the 4% rule, the 2-hour rule or whatever, they always tend to not really fly.
What is it about humans that we want a rule for everything? We just want like an easy fix it like summary, and now we do this, we'll be all right.
Yeah, well, because it's just easy, and just looking at on the bright side, we do want to do things to better our lives. So if our goal is to reach 10,000 steps every day or to spend 10,000 hours, we think we're moving towards something and achieving something, and it's much easier to hit one particular target if that target is quantifiable and it's a singular target than if it was something which we're looking at the quality of practice, not just the quantity. So I'm doing tennis, am I really practicing sort of my backhand, which is my difficult stroke, or practicing serving, which I don't like practicing as much? Am I playing more competitive games and trying to keep score? So we want to look at these target, and then once we have this numerical target, try to find maybe the simplest way to achieve that target.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. I think it's really useful, and I think in the modern era of us all being told we can get rich quick, it's really useful to have this kind of framework and skepticism that people can apply to that.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. And what I learned about investing is you can get rich, but get rich slowly. So that's the goal, is to get rich and get very rich, but you can get very rich if you take it a slow and informed approach.
Yeah, and I really mean it about the book. The storytelling is excellent. I think we can see that in the way you speak, that you speak in stories. So we'll link it in the show notes and stuff as well, so people can grab a copy.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Alex Edmonds, what a legend. To sign up for our newsletter, use the link in the description below, get a summary of today's episode.
And this episode right here is the one that you need to watch next, where we look at the intelligence trap, which is a similar kind of theme.
Let us know you made it to the end of the video by leaving a comment in the comment section, even though we know it's all a lie and we're all biased and it's all a load of bollocks.
We love getting your comments. All a load of bollocks.